Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 AP English, our Roberts text, and we're working, of course, in our poetic section here. I'm with you on page 656 of that volume, Thomas Hardy's classic, The Man He Killed. Now, of course, Hardy we know already, our LearnStrong.net work. We've worked with his Darkling Thrush, as well as Are You Digging on My Grave? Some of you saying that may be the darkest poem you've ever read. Hardy, the great novelist, but also Hardy, the amazing poet. He was one of those few artists that could excel in both domains. Of course, this becomes a really important poem in the history of what is sometimes referred to as pacifist literature. That idea that resolution of conflict vis-a-vis war inevitably leads to complications which are troubling. The Man He Killed. Let's just read it together. Published, by the way, in 1902. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have set us down to wet right many a naprocan, beer I drink, but ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe. Just so. My foe, of course he was. That's clear enough. Although he thought he'd list perhaps offhand, just as I was out of work and sold his traps. No other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You shoot a fellow down, you'd treat if met where any bar is, or help to half a crown. Now, of course, this poem is disturbing in its implications. Notice we move from the pronouns I to you. Notice, of course, we begin with a rhetorical styled question. The person you're fighting in war, if you had met them in another venue, like a bar, for example, you probably would just have struck up a conversation and you would have become friends with the individual. But instead, staring face to face in wartime, notice the construction in 2b of this poem, met, wet, in, naprocan. In other words, we have rhyme scheme going on here. Notice the rhythms, had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, that iambic bum, 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 right? But then in the third stanza, notice, I shot him dead because, and then that Emily Dickinson-esque use of the hyphen, because is repeated. It's almost as if the speaker of the poem is trying to come up with the real reason why. Well, of course, it was called self-preservation, right? In other words, because he was my foe. Notice the phrase just so, sounding almost like an E.E. Cummings poem in that regards. My foe, of course, he was. Notice the repetition. It's almost like the speaker's trying to convince himself, no, this is totally rational. Notice in the end, it's very quaint. It's curious, maybe, at the most. Obviously, the irony is just dark in this poem. It's clearly a tragic situation, right? And then he begins to muse about the very one who was his enemy in the first place. Maybe like me, he just kind of offhandedly decided to, enlist, and there wasn't any real reason for it. Yeats's Irish Airman is going to come to mind immediately, right? There's nothing really, the Irish Airman will say, that I really had anything to lose, I had nothing to gain, whatever, Finally, of course, the idea that words, quaint, ironic, obviously, use of the word, and then notice the use of the pronoun you at the end of the poem. You shoot a fellow down, you'd treat if met where any bar is, or you'd help to half a crown. Well, what are we going to say about this as a message at 2a? Obviously, war is tragic, it's cruel, it's illogical, it makes no sense. Obviously, at 3a, we're going to think about texts like the Iliad, that so vividly, and Virgil's Aeneid as well, as we've said in our lectures, so vividly demonstrates at times the senselessness of what happens in war. At 2b, obviously, the ironic tone is powerful. At 3a, well, we mentioned in other titles. We obviously mentioned the Iliad, Yeats's Irish Airman, Rupert Brooke's The Soldier, Siegfried Sassoon's Wirers, as well as Wilfred Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth, already lectures on LearnStrong.net. We've also got Randall Jarrell's Death of the Bolter Gunner, Owen's famous Dulce et Discordames, and we'll get to that later in the Roberts volume. What is your favorite text about the insanity of war, the craziness of war? Not that it's celebrated in some video game-like situation, but rather Oliver Stone's Platoon comes to mind, or Born on the 4th of July comes to mind. What are the titles for you, though, that most powerfully demonstrate this idea? And then finally at 3B, to relate to this title in some way, what is your view about war as a notion of the necessity of war to resolve conflict? Do you think, in fact, it is a necessity? Steinbeck, of course, writing about that whole idea of what happens to veterans who are in wartime and then have to return. We're familiar with the challenges of post-traumatic stress syndrome. What are your thoughts about that? And what's a moment in your own biography or in the biography of somebody you know who had to deal with some of the implications of a text like this? Well, thank you. I hope that you'll be driven to think about these topics and read more of Thomas Hardy as well. Thank you.